11. The motif of corn seeds is often connected with the underworld mother goddess. Among other things, seeds are a symbol of the souls of the dead and of the ancestral ghosts. In ancient Greece, near the hearth in the house, pots were placed in which were corn seeds made up into a kind of fig jelly with other ingredients. The pots symbolically represented the womb of the underworld, the womb of the earth, and the seeds were the dead who rest in the earth, like the corn that resurrects in spring. The dead, or the ghosts, were called Demetrioi, those who belong to Demeter and who rest like corn in the womb of that goddess. In a festival held at about the date of our All Souls Day, the pots were uncovered, and it was believed that the underworld was thus opened. The Latin expression that Carl Kirini often uses is mundus patet, the cosmos is open. For 3 days the ghosts lived with the living. They came back and roamed about the house, and everything was full of spooks. They participated at the meals, where a portion was always put aside for them. Then, after 3 days, they were driven out of the house with olive twigs and holy water, and told that now they had had enough and were to return to their own world and not spook about and disturb the living any longer. And the lids were replaced on the pots. Poppy seeds also point to the world of the dead and the ghosts. They are nourishing and also have a soporific effect similar to hashish and all those remedies which, according to primitive belief, are a means for contacting the beyond, such as chewing ivy leaves and other poisonous substances. So poppy seeds have to do with the mystery of sinking into the beyond, the underworld, and getting into touch with its secrets. Thus, in its deepest meaning, grains have something to do with the mystery of life and death and of transformation. This metaphor appears in the Bible, where Jesus speaks of the grain of wheat falling into the ground, and there dying, and then bringing forth much fruit. The analogy in alchemical writings is referred to as the problem of the multiplicatio. They say that at a certain moment, when the philosopher's stone is made, the vessel is opened and the stone begins to emanate a transforming activity, and every metal touched by it is transformed into gold. The analogy is that the philosopher's stone is made inside a vessel, where it goes through dissolution in the darkness and then resurrects. The vessel is opened and the stone develops into an activity which was called the process of multiplication. The psychological analogy seems to have to do with the fact that when one succeeds consciously and positively to relate to an archetypal constellation, there is a widespread effect. If the rainmaker or the medicine man gets in touch in the right way with the powers of the beyond, rain falls over the whole country. Confucius said that if the nobleman sits in his room and has the right thoughts and writes down the right things, he is heard 1,000 miles round. The Taoist philosopher Zhang Xu always comments on the point that as long as the ruler of the country tries to do the right thing, actively making good or bad laws, the empire will get worse and worse. If, on the contrary, he retires and gets right inwardly, then the problems of the empire are solved by themselves too. Another variation is the story of the ruler of the Yellow Earth, who went to the original mist, the primeval mist, saying he wanted to do the right thing and be inwardly right, so that people did not cheat in his empire and everyone had enough to eat. Original Mist simply said, "I have no idea how you can do that." So the ruler of the Yellow Earth left his empire and for 3 months sat on straw in a hut, and then returned to Original Mist and said, "Could I humbly ask you how I could bring myself into order?" Original Mist replied that he should not think of putting things right, but should stay in reality and not bother about outer things. Stay where he was, and so on. Then the ruler asked, "What about nature?" To which Original Mist replied, "You always think nature comes to an end, but she is only at the beginning. You always think nature knows her aims, but it goes much further. You always think nature has now given everything, but nature has still more in store." But then he added, "I don't want to talk to mortal beings. The people are fading away, they are dying. I am alone. I am eternal. And he turned away from the ruler of the yellow earth. All these stories refer to the secret that ultimately we can touch something which is the universality or oneness of nature, which generally manifests itself in synchronistic events. If one succeeds in getting oneself right about a problem, miracles begin to happen, and the outside falls into place too, as though one had had an effect which, rationally, one could not possibly have had. One probably should not think of cause and effect in this connection, for we have not caused things to get right. They get right, synchronistically. I have quoted earlier the Chinese saying in the I Ching that the superior man knows the germs and acts at once, and so brings things into order. One could compare the corn and poppy seeds to these germs, for they are germs of situations which one has to clarify in the moment when they are still germs. And if patiently one succeeds in doing so, then one can disentangle them, or give a possible turn to impossible situations. How deep these things go, one cannot say, but I think that has very much to do with the feminine godhead and her uncanny powers. Women, to a great extent, and the less they know about it, the worse it is, rule even life and death in their surroundings. If the husband dies, or the children die, very often the women in that family had something to do with it. But it would be inflation, and it is absolutely destructive. If a woman thinks she is responsible, for then she identifies with the great mother goddess. As an ego, the woman is responsible only for her conscious deeds and no more. I have seen many pre-psychotic borderline cases who become psychotic by thinking that they were responsible to a greater extent than they were. I remember the case of a mother through whose mind the thought flashed when saying goodbye to her son when he went to war, and that wouldn't much mind if he didn't come back, and he didn't. And then she was convinced that she was responsible for his death. That is plain inflation. It is quite natural that people who live together should at times wish each other dead. I have never analyzed any human being, man or woman, where I couldn't see that they had such wishes against others, half consciously and half not. That is nature, and it is better to admit it. Neither have I analyzed a mother who, from time to time, hasn't wished all her children at the bottom of the sea. Not literally, but for God's sake, let's get rid of the whole lot. If the ego identifies with that in the wrong way, the devil is loose. But all the same, though the ego is only responsible for what it does, there is underneath this tremendous nature in woman which wishes for life or death for those around her. I would say that the dark side of the self in every woman has that capacity of wishing for life or death. If it is not misused in white or black magic, if the ego remains with its own task, this has a tremendous effect. People blossom in the surrounding of a woman who is in the right relationship with herself, because then she is rather like the positive mother goddess who makes corn grow. But if the relationship with her own inner self is wrong, she is more likely to emanate the effects of the death goddess Hecate and put a blight of death over those around. Children sometimes look marvelous and blossom in a house where the mother may shout that she wishes they were all in hell. Why? Because in her own way she is right with Tao. Her positive instinct supports the children with a positive vital something, which gives them security, even though she may tell them they are the devil's spawn and horrible brats. The Cinderella task would be the task of the woman, to penetrate into the depths of her secret, small effects, and to bring consciousness and selective discrimination into that hidden nature of hers, which operates in her background. If she can penetrate that realm, and there separate bad from good, she does something which corresponds to the hero's deeds of slaying the dragon, or building the new town, or freeing the people from terror. In analysis, one often has to sort out such seeds with the analysand. For instance, once a woman from South Africa went on a trip with her husband and their 2 boys to fish in a river, and the boat overturned. The 2 boys could not swim, and the father carried both ashore but then collapsed with a heart attack and died on the spot. The woman couldn't drive the car or was too much shaken to do so, and the three sat there for a day and a half until someone came by and found them and brought them back with the husband's dead body. Later, the younger son began to behave in a completely psychotic way. For 2 months, he did no work at school and then didn't go at all, but climbed onto the roofs of lower cottages and houses and stood there absolutely raving and throwing knives at the passers-by. He never slept, but cried and raved the whole night through and looked absolutely mad and miserable. The mother went to doctors all over the world, and everybody, including myself, when she consulted me, thought that it had to do with that trauma, the horrible accident in which the father lost his life, and they're sitting out in the cold with his dead body. I asked her about the boy's dreams, and among others, she told me the following. He was shut in a room where there was a television. That was some years ago, and in that country not everybody had a television, so it was rather a thrill. The door of the room was shut, and a voice said, "You must stay in here from now on, and your life is a failure." The dream had just knocked him out. Here is the plain statement of the beginning of the psychosis. He is shut up with the images of his own unconscious. He is cut off from life, and life is from now on a failure at 7 years old. And the outer picture said exactly the same thing. Diagnosis hopeless. But something in me revolted, and I couldn't accept that, and thought perhaps the dream could have a perspective meaning, for something in it did not seem to indicate a psychosis. The dream was plain, clear, and well constructed, which was healthy. In its wickedness, the dream had a healthy smell, a smack in the face, but so well given that it didn't seem psychotic. It was too plainly wicked. So I wondered who would benefit from such a slap in the face, and thought that a madly, morbidly ambitious person might. For somebody crazily and psychotically ambitious, it might be a good thing to have to face the fact that one's life was a failure, that one just had to sit in one's room and everything was finished. I asked the mother whether the boy had always been ambitious and had tried to push himself in school. She said no, that he was quite an average boy and didn't care if the others were better than he. He wasn't ambitious. Then I wondered if it was the mother's ambition for the boy, so I made a shot in the dark and told her that the boy's trouble had nothing to do with the accident to her husband, but with her, and that she was exaggeratedly ambitious for the boy, which was what was ruining him. She broke down and howled and howled and howled, tons of seawater, and admitted it. Apparently, she had always spun hero fantasies onto her husband, who was rather miserable, delicate, introverted, helpless, and had always been disappointed. Directly after his death, the weight of her ambitious demands fell upon the son, and as she preferred the youngest boy, it fell upon him. After the accident, she had read some psychological books about what happened to a fatherless child, about the Oedipus complex, and decided that her son should not become a mama's boy, so began to be absolutely hard with him, planning to make him into a hero. Imagine the situation of a small boy who had lost his father with such a horrible shock, and whose mother, instead of comforting him, dropped him like a hot potato. That was enough to make a boy go up on the roof and throw knives at people. Anybody else would have done the same. Looked at from the boy's standpoint, well, she was a tough woman, tremendously vital and quite intelligent. So I told her what I thought of her. The next day when she came, she said the boy had slept 8 hours completely normally, and in the morning had gotten up and had gone to school. The real trouble had been her dream of the hero, and the boy had to be the hero. She had the hero archetype in her unconscious, but was too lazy to live up to her own capacities. So she thought that her men should do it, if not her husband, then her boy. To live a heroic life herself would be too much trouble. The hero fantasy was the seed, the germ that constellated the archetypal layers of the unconscious. If she had sorted those seeds, known what was in them, she would A, not have put her hero fantasy onto her husband or son, and B, probably have discovered that she had to do something herself. It was the tremendous greater potential within her that had such destructive effects. Something positive at the bottom of her soul that had negative effects. since she had never sorted it out within herself. Naturally, she alone was not responsible for the husband's death and the boy's behavior, because another person might not have emanated any negative effects. People always try to project their fantasies onto others, but a fairly healthy person shakes them off, unconsciously and instinctively. If I had had to analyze her husband, I would not have spoken of the wife as the guilty person, but looked to see what was wrong with him. And that woman shouldn't now say that she was responsible for the two events. That is only true cum grano salis. The extent of her guilt lay only in not having sowed the seeds. If a woman has a powerful animus, she just has it. It cannot be gotten rid of. One can only make the rest of it, and our experience is that one is less possessed if one makes some use of it. All that business of burying the husband and the quickly reading up what Freud had written and then determining to make the boy a hero, that is animus. She was already in the thrall of the animus. But usually if a woman does something about a powerful animus, it wears off a little, and the needle swings back to the feminine side. If you have worked like a man, then you are apt to feel that it would be nicer to be a woman and not work so hard. The question of guilt is terribly delicate. One simply does not know where to put the exact borderline. To some people, one has to say, for God's sake, do not have such a silly inflation as to think you are the mother goddess of nature and that you govern the life and death of those around you. But to those who have the illusion that they always do the right thing, one has to say, well, I do think it is a little strange that two of your husbands died. It is a question of a millimeter, one thing to one person and the opposite to another. Some people exaggerate their guilt, and the dreams show that they have an inflation. Then one must say, nonsense, you are not powerful enough to kill all those men. You would just like to feel like the mother goddess who is responsible for everything, and that is a silly inflation. Nature killed your husband. He died of cancer or a heart attack, and not because of you. One can just as well say that the suicidal man chose her because he wanted a rock against which to wreck his ship, and therefore he is guilty, not she. It is a question which can only be decided individually, with oneself and with the others involved. One must try to make a balance from the dreams, find a middle attitude without an inch too much or too little guilt. That is exactly the work of the sorting of the seeds, trying to become conscious down to the very bottom of the situation, and then to know what's what, and what has what effect, and to be as humbly conscientious about it as possible, but without inflation or making sweeping statements. Quite practically, sorting the seeds would require an enormous amount of careful self-discipline and great conscientiousness, and to do so for a long time would be the woman's heroic deed. Such work strengthens consciousness and the feelings of responsibility because, as I have said, the devil tells you all the time that one more or less doesn't matter, or that there are no more black seeds in that, and there you are. Now comes the problem of the three pairs of hands, about which the heroine prefers not to ask any questions. As we cannot understand this motif from that one fairy tale, I would like to amplify it, for it is an archetypal motif that has many variations which are very revealing. There is a Grimm's fairy tale called Mrs. Trude. A little girl who is very obstinate and never obeys her parents lives near the wood and is told by her parents not to go into the woods or to Mrs. Trude's hut, or that will be the end of her. Naturally, she slips out of the house at the first chance and goes there. At the door of the hut, a black man meets her. On the stairs, a man in green. At the top, a man in red clothes. They just quickly walk past her, and she enters Frau Trude's room. There the old witch with a big nose sits by the fireplace. The child, shivering slightly, says, "Mrs. Trude, who is the black man?" And the witch says, "Oh, that was only the chimney sweep." "And who is the green man?" she asks. Frau Trude answers, "Oh, that was the huntsman." Then she asks who the red man was, and is told that that was the butcher. And then the little girl says, "I looked through the window and I didn't see you, but the devil with a fiery head." "Oh," says Frau Trude, "so you saw the witch in her right form. I have long waited and longed for you, and you shall give me a good light." And she takes the little girl and turns her into a piece of wood and throws her into the fire. When the wood is glowing hot, she sits beside it and warms herself and says, "That gives a good bright light." In the Vasilisa tale, the men were white, black, and red, and here they are red, green, and black. Obviously, the black man is the devil, who also very often appears in fairy tales as the green huntsman, and the red man is another form of the devil. So actually those are three of Frau Trude's familiars, namely three aspects of the devil. Mrs. Trude, or the Great Mother Goddess, generally lives in close associations with the dark underworld godhead, the devil, and there is very often the triadic structure. In our civilization, this lower triad is a compensation for the upper trinity, just as the Virgin Mary would be the female figure in the upper trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Ghost, with the Virgin Mary a little outside. So there is a quaternary below with Frau Trude and the three aspects of the devil, the divine underworld totality against the spiritual and positive divine totality. The three pairs of cut-off hands therefore probably refer to the same kind of secret, namely that of a close association of the Mother Goddess with the last ultimate principle of evil and destructiveness, which is at the bottom of the abyss of every human being. As we cannot take this figure of the Baba Yaga as a personal content of the unconscious, but rather as a personification of what one could call nature itself, as a nature goddess, we can say that the pairs of hands refer to the unthinkable cruelty and murderousness of nature itself. Nobody has normal human feelings can avoid being shocked by this incredible cruelty at some time in life. One sees how animals eat each other, and we can thank God when it is possible not to have to look at it. In fact, we blind ourselves, we look away. We have probably all had the moral shock of discovering how nature deals with her children, of seeing a human being slowly and cruelly eaten up by cancer, or some such disease which just slowly consumes the person. The worst sadistic torture, a psychotic torture, could not have as cruel fantasies about how to torture people to death as nature has. Sometimes, for instance, in the woods or in the mountains, you see a roebuck trying to crawl over the ice with a cancerous growth hanging from it. The other roebuck kick it aside and it sinks, then struggles up and walks a few steps farther, dragging itself along for weeks with the cancer, until one day, thank God, it does not get up anymore. Where a fox will partially eat a swan frozen on the ice and leave it to struggle for hours and hours with the wing eaten away, unless a human being chances to come by and give it a coup de grace. Who is responsible? Those are the horrors of nature which nobody can swallow. It is something one cannot even talk about. And this fairy tale says that it shows a certain kind of healthy reaction or wisdom, not to poke into these things too much and not to ask too many questions. How would a question help? There is no answer. We can shake our fists at the goddess, but that doesn't help. And we shall never figure out why this is so. It is just so. This is the abysmal shadow of Baba Yaga, an abyss into which one can only look with horror and turn away. Nature has that secret of killing in the most cruel way, and also giving birth in the most beautiful way to the most beautiful things. Another German fairy tale in the collection, German fairy tales since Grimm, called Waldemänchen, contains the same motif as Mrs. Trude, but in a milder form. The parents of an obstinate little girl tell her that if she is not obedient, the Waldemänchen will come and fetch her. The child also has the habit of teasing the other children a bit cruelly at school. One day a green-looking old woman comes out of the woods, grabs her, and carries her away into the woods to a lot of very nice children who are picking daisies and amusing themselves. Waldemänchen tells her that she must behave nicely with the children and play with them, that she wants to educate her and will stay with her. The child is rather frightened, but behaves and plays with the children and has a very nice day. They get good food and the Waldemänchen looks after them. But the morning the little girl starts her old tricks again, and the children complain. "Alright," says Waldmenschen, and she seizes the little girl and puts her through one of the 3 water mills in the woods. There are 3 men standing around, the male consorts of the great goddess, and they throw her into the mill, and she is ground to bits and come out the other end as a very hunchbacked old woman. Waldmenschen says, "What is old should become young, and what is young should become old." When the child sees herself in the mirror, she is very downcast and absolutely in despair, but she has to stay like that for some time. When she has learned her lesson, Waldmenschen puts her again through the mill, but in reverse, and she is young again. Then the father appears. His sorrow over his lost child has turned him into an old man, so he is put into the rejuvenating mill, after which the 2 walk home, and the girl behaves and becomes a good woman. The nature goddess has a mill, which grinds people instead of corn, the mill of youth and old age, a milder form of life and death. Here the goddess is timeless, and is the great magician who bestows youth or old age upon people. If you compare what happens to the 3 girls, Vasilisa, the girl in Frau Trude, and the girl in Waldmenschen, you will see that the facets shown by the nature goddess depend on the attitude of the visitor. In Frau Trude, the girl was a silly, infantile, wicked little creature and got destroyed. In Waldmenschen, she only got punished. Vasilisa, who behaved correctly, was helped. So Mother Nature's attitude depends on the human being. It is interesting to see that infantile curiosity is looked on as something extremely destructive. Curious inquisitiveness, as far as I have seen, is not so often punished in myths about heroes, though it often attracts destruction to the heroine. The fact that Vasilisa does not ask about the hands saves her life, but the Frau True child pokes into secrets which should be respected. When women have an undeveloped animus, when they have not worked on the animus, their mental functions often remain fixed on gossip and thinking about their neighbors. They get interested in divorce in the neighborhood and want to know how it came about. They talk in a half psychological way. It is more than just interest in the divorce. It is a kind of germ-like psychological interest. For instance, there is the thought, why do men and women quarrel? But it never gets further. It remains on the level of curiosity, and they never get to the bottom of anything. If such a woman could say, what does this have to do with me? I am not interested in a personal way, but am fascinated by the question as to why men and women do not get on with each other. She might get somewhere, but instead it remains stuck in a kind of half-developed mental operation, neither disinterested nor objective, which I think is typical for an undeveloped animus. That has to do with destructive inquisitiveness, and there the devil has his hand in it. The problem of the divine function of evil is something one cannot really touch on openly because people always blow up about it. It is so ambiguous that one can really only do what Vasilisa does, yet in some mysterious way, evil in its worst destructiveness is connected with the laws of life. For instance, one could say that Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz had a positive side, for they shocked European civilizations into realizing their shadow. But we cannot say that. We have to stay on the human side and say that that was simply plain murder and that no obvious excuse about a secret positive effect can be made. Otherwise, we become demonic. The very thing we have looked at. It happens that natural scientists get into the demonism of thinking like nature. A famous man named Nikolai wrote The Biology of War, in which he absolutely coldly and from a natural scientific standpoint investigated the question as to war being a good or bad thing from the standpoint of the biology of the race. He asked whether it destroyed the good or the bad elements and so on. To study that needs a demonic mind. Our human nature revolts at looking at things in such a way. But go to a university. Go to people who discuss the atomic question. They are in that spirit of nature. They speak of mass destruction and how to deal with it. They are possessed by the evil hands. On the other hand, perhaps it is sometimes a man's fate that he has to expand into such thoughts. Physicians, for instance, must acquire some of that demonic mind because they deal too much with nature and its cruelty. In the first semester, when corpses are dissected, either the student walks out and says he cannot become a doctor, or he has to acquire something of the demonic coldness of nature and say that there are always thousands of people who die, and one must be able to look, for that is reality. But if one doesn't know what one does, one becomes completely devilish oneself. A doctor, for instance, may impersonally watch a horrible disease in a patient, who for him is number so-and-so in bed in so-and-so suffering from a disease which takes such and such a form. But one day his wife and little daughter get the same disease, and he gets the shock of his life. Then usually there is the awful conflict between the cold medical man who simply sees the illness as a process of natural science, how it will proceed and end, and the human being to whom that is now a unique event and a feeling catastrophe. It is the clash of the two attitudes. In our tale, it is not evident whom the hands belong to. That gives a hint that one should not ask what is behind. I think, to a certain extent, it is a woman's task to hold on to the personal side against the cold spirit of natural science. A doctor has to expose himself and say that he cannot be sentimental, but has to face such things and be detached. A surgeon cannot operate if he is sentimental about the person on whom he is operating. But the woman has to put the emphasis upon and hold to the human side, where things and diseases are unique, and the feeling reaction remains unique, where one does not, in a cold, statistical way, write off the other human being. If a woman starts to think like that, it is always from the animus, and it has a very destructive effect. She should preserve the personal atmosphere between human beings. To create the human atmosphere of Eros is one of her tasks, and to that belongs the necessity of not investigating too deeply into those shadowy things, into the impersonal, cold cruelty of nature. Vasilisa has to sort out the grain, and then those mysterious hands take the sorted grain, and we don't know what they do with them. Why would Baba Yaga, the great magician, not sort them out herself? We do not know, but it seems possible that she could not do so. The ethical discrimination is something specifically human which transcends the otherwise known nature. That is what Jung thought. That man transcends the Godhead a very minimal bit because of being a little more conscious. In this, man has to help the Godhead serve him or her, but naturally that does not mean that we can eliminate evil either from God or from nature. We can work on the unconscious, but we cannot eliminate evil from nature or prevent millions of creatures dying a cruel or dreadful death every second on this planet. We shall never be able to remove sickness and death out of the world. There are limits to what humans can do in a place where nature takes over. She will never stop those mills. The Far East civilizations try to cope with this problem in a different way, by seeing the relativity of good and evil and then detaching from the problem. Lately I have just reread a little in Zhang Su, and it struck me that sometimes he says that the wise or great man just looks at nature and becomes like her. There is a certain reckless cruelty in that. The Taoist wise man, as Zhang Su represents it, should not mourn too much of his greatest friend or his wife, and if his head pupil or his master dies. He performs the mourning ceremony but no more, and for our Christian tradition this is rather shocking. But then, and that comforted me a lot, there is another place where Zhang Su says, the really enlightened Taoist master does not strive to be good, but is just like nature. He lets things be. He neither strives to save, nor to do anything good. And if the other is ill, he would not go and nurse him. That looks like nature taking its course. The other is ill, so that's that. But then he adds that he loves everybody from the overflow of his natural goodness. There is natural feeling sympathy for the other person, and that is allowed. But to strive out of moral, ethical principles is against nature and therefore dubious. It has a secret counter effect. But if, out of an overflow of natural goodness, I go and nurse my friend when he is ill, carried by a natural elan, then I am not doing evil. That is permitted, because there will be no comeback in the way of feeling demands, or wanting the other to show gratitude. It is the most subtle way of transcending the ethical and getting into something which is perhaps the nearest to being absolutely good. But it is so subtle that one can only describe it in paradox. In the West, it is much more difficult because we have done much more on the side of striving for the absolute good and have accumulated such an abyss of horror on the other side that our problem has become insoluble. There's another type of story concerning the Dark Mother figure in which the heroine intrudes into the secret of the terrible Great Mother and then denies having done so. There is, for instance, an Austrian story called The Black Woman, in which the Black Woman is the owner of a castle. She hires a poor farmer's girl to do the cleaning work, and she is not supposed to go into one particular room, but does so, and finds that the Black Woman is slowly being turned white by her work. The girl quickly withdraws, but thereafter is continually persecuted by the Black Woman as to whether she has been in the room or not. She simply lies and says she is not, with the result that at the crucial moment when she is on the point of being burned as a witch, the Black Woman, who is now white, announces, "Had you once said that you had been in the room, I would have reduced you to dust and ashes. But now you have liberated me, and you will be rewarded." She was rewarded for lying. In another German version, the girl pokes into the horrible secret of the Mother Goddess, who says afterward to her, "My child, did you see me in my suffering?" And the girl denies it, saying she had noticed nothing. She too is rewarded for her lies. So not poking into Mother Nature's secrets or lying about it if one has done so, pretending one has not seen anything even though one did, is a great deed and the right thing to do, according to the story. If the Mother Goddess were a human being, we could understand it. She did not want her shadow, her deficiencies, or her suffering to be seen. Though she pretends to be the great goddess, she is really a very needy, suffering, unhappy creature, and that is what she does not want the human being to see. But this is something we meet with every day. If you try to touch an Analazan's shadow, they simply explode and go for you. An Analazan may have a horrible shadow, which you may see in the first hour, and sometimes they say, "You always talk about other people, but what is my shadow?" You can just say that you have noticed nothing, that you do not know the Analazan very well yet. You have to lie, because you touched the box of dynamite. The whole thing will just blow up and all the relationship with it. Probably there is an analogy to this human situation, but here it is the goddess who wants to be tactfully protected, and that has to do with a deep-rooted, primitive religious attitude. Such an archaic attitude can still be found among men in the Alps. Above Seelisberg there is a beautiful path with a view of the whole of Woldwasserstedersee, the lake of the four cantons, but when you round the corner, suddenly you see the lake from a completely different angle. If the sun is shining, the lake, instead of being green, is light, and there is a wide open landscape in the vista of the whole of the Alps. If you can be impressed by the beauty of nature, you will experience a moment when you catch your breath. Even Swiss cowards, who are rather tough people, are apparently impressed by that. For they say at this corner very often the cows suddenly disappear. At this moment, they say, you must be very careful and not panic or look for the cows, or some accident might happen. One of the cows might fall into the abyss, or you might fall over the edge. They say you must crack your whip and go on calling to the cows as though they were there, and pretend that nothing had happened. And after a few minutes, they will once more be walking along in front of you. That is a religious gesture. When I am overwhelmed, I am likely to have an animal-like panic reaction, which would immediately react on the cows, which are extremely sensitive to the state of the coward. And if he is in a panic, they too are lost, or might do anything. But if one is in a panic, it is no good preaching to oneself, so the cowherd just assumes that the cows are gone and pretends at the same time not to have noticed it. He lies to himself, and so saves his own skin and the whole situation. The same thing happens when people have a very severe shock. There is a delayed reaction. If you tell them that a near relative is dead, they perhaps just thank you for telling them and go on with what they were doing. That is, They just block off the shock by pretending nothing has happened until the worst is over. Then they generally break down and cry and have a normal reaction. To very sensitive people who could collapse through a shock, this helpful delay in nature occurs, and the pretense of not having noticed is a deep saving instinct in man and the basis of many religious rituals. I think it should be recognized positively as a healthy reaction in certain situations. But why does Mother Nature want that? That it is good for us, and what is good for Vasilisa is clear. But why does Mother Nature herself not want to be seen in her evil aspect? Naturally, we do not know what she is in herself. But I am speaking figuratively and asking, why does the archetypal figure, which seems to represent something like the power of nature, want to hide its horrible aspect? We have to think naively. It looks as though she were ashamed of herself. She behaves exactly like a human being who is ashamed. There seems to be a tendency in nature which longs for the greater consciousness of man that makes for a strange theology. We cannot say whether this is absolutely true, but the documents of the unconscious say so. If that were true, we would have a fair chance that, in spite of the catastrophic developments with which we are now confronted, nature intends to save man, to go on with the experiment man which we are. We cannot assert in a metaphysical way that nature in itself really does that, and it is the same when talking about the figure of God. Jung always insists that he is not saying metaphysically that God is so, but that the image of God is so in man, and the unconscious psyche manifests in such a way. I would not call that only a projection. The unconscious is nature in man, so one must say that nature, the psychic nature in man, describes nature as wanting to become more human and less cruel. That it is absolutely so is beyond the possibility of scientific investigation. We can only state that the unconscious psyche of man mirrors nature as having such a tendency, and it seems both healthy and helpful for us to believe it. Whether it is in itself or not is something one can never say in psychology, for we do not know what nature is in itself. We can only say that nature mirrors itself in our unconscious as something infinitely horrible and cruel, but that it has a secret longing to get out of that. So this is the source of a certain optimism in the Jungian approach. Why should we work with people if they were only devils? If one looks at evil things too closely, and not in a mature way but naively, one gets cynical. If you walk through the museum which now exists about Auschwitz, what is your conclusion? Schopenhauer said that another man is to a human being just good enough to grease his boots with his fat. If you embrace that philosophy, the next consequence is that you say, I'm going to take a Luger or Colt, and I intend to survive and to hell with the others. They are murderers anyhow. They all want to kill me, so I'm going to shoot first. That's the consequence. If I cannot do the human thing of turning away, then by looking at it, I act out myself the cruelty of nature. That's why in the reverence of the chthonic god in antiquity, people turned away and covered their faces. And when they prayed to Hecate, they put on a black veil over their heads so as not to see her, in order not to become like her.